No problem.
So welcome to Meaningful Interviews with Rabbi Chaim Dalfin. I'm your host, and my guest today is Rabbi Laibel Wolf. Rabbi Wolf is an old family friend and a great scholar, and has been teaching and lecturing and counseling for the last 40 years. I have a recollection, Laibel, that you had a relationship with my wife, Zayda Abzalma Serebransky, and I wanted to hear a little bit about that. And really what I'm getting at is the following question to you. What made and makes Laibel Wolf? Not just today, but the past. You know, the Laibel Wolf of today is Baruch Hashem known and has done tremendous things, but a person is formed in their youth. And I'd like to hear a little bit about that to understand you and my listeners and viewers. They really want to know, who is this Rabbi Laibel Wolf from the inside? Go ahead.
That's a very demanding request. One of the things that I certainly recognize is that as you grow a little more mature in years, you begin to understand better who you were in your youth. And certainly I remember my youth very, very well. I was the child of Holocaust survivors. We came to Australia when I was 2 years of age, so I was effectively raised in Australia. But of course, I recall my parents screaming in their sleep, recalling the horrors of Poland. My father was, as a young man, a yeshiva bocher when the war broke out in the Radomsky yeshiva. And he and the family were working also in the business, which was a very successful business. His parents and the older brothers and some sisters, and the Nazis put a commissar in there. And one day the commissar got greedy and in front of my father shot his parents, family, executed them. And my father, being the youngest, somehow managed to escape. And but he was caught later on, some weeks later on, and put into a labor camp. They smuggled into the labor camp some guns. My father somehow had an outside contact, and 3 of them fought their way out. Later on, I learned that that particular contact was a non-Jewish Polak, a young guy who they played soccer in the streets of Krakow, where my father lived. And one day, many, many years later, we're talking about in the 70s, I guess, maybe later, my father was watching TV and he sees a face on the TV and he says, that's him. That's the guy who smuggled the guns in. And that guy was Pope Paul John.
Wow.
Who was, as a young man, he was in the Polish underground.
Wow.
At any rate, my youthful years were spent trying to empathize with what my parents went through. And I think I was a fairly angry young person, always very, very, some ways guilt-ridden in ways that a young person cannot begin to understand the causes for, anything like that. I knew I had to make good to Jewishness. My parents, after the war, I understand for some years, I was a very, very young child at the time, had a difficult relationship with God. And although my father and mother were both raised in very frum backgrounds, after the war, there was a hiatus, a period where perhaps they didn't practice it to the extent that they did previously. But they came back to it. And I was raised in an environment that was quite Jewish in orientation, although I remember not every mitzvah was kept as meticulously as later on. And therefore, in this somewhat ambivalent setting, I found myself also drawn to other things in life, and especially when I was a young university student, I certainly allowed myself to enter the arena of many different schools of thought, non-Jewish as well, until one day, my father told me that a certain elderly chassid wanted to meet with me. And I remember I was in second year of law school at the time, and I didn't know till much later that that elderly chassid, who was Reb Zalman Serebriansky, alav shalom, whom you mentioned indirectly through your wife, she's the granddaughter, was actually quite close to my father and was like a paternal figure to my father in those formative years, the decade and a half after they emigrated to Australia. At any rate, Reb Zalman met with me. I met with him. I went to his little unit, little apartment, and he challenged me to study with him. And I didn't know exactly what it was that we were studying. I was quite understanding of the broad spectrum of Judaism. I could learn a Blat Gemara, even though I wasn't necessarily a very frum person at the time. And he actually introduced me to Yechidus, which I hadn't touched. And as we studied Yechidus, my personal curiosity was piqued, and I found it to be a very profound worldview and philosophy of life, but more than that, a pathway of Judaism that I found attractive. And I kept coming to him, and I think I ended up studying with Reb Zalman for some 20 years plus, long after I married. And I could certainly say that he was the most formative Jewish influence in my life. He introduced me to the Rabbi, and then as a young man, even before I married, I had communication and correspondence with the Rabbi. And I was very, very touched that the Rebbe even responded back to a young, wild kid at the time. But of course, it's left an eternal effect on me. And I guess the rest is history. I became closer and closer into the Hasidic way of life and took it up with a vengeance. And I ended up being the first kohelnik in Australia. A kohelnik being a person who after marriage continues studying. There wasn't a kollel, such an institute for young married men yet in Australia, but there was a rabbinical college, a yeshiva gedola, which Reb Zalman was the principal and founder. And he allowed me, whilst I was still at university finishing my law degree, to spend half a day learning in the yeshiva gedola at that time. And later on, afterwards, that was further on, I went and studied for the smicha, for the rabbinate, which I completed in Israel, and received the smicha from the chief rabbi, and also from the Sephardi chief rabbi, who I greatly admired there at the time. And history went on, and I continued trying to do the best that I could to make up what the Rebbe often described as what we have to do as a duty, as a consequence of losing such a proportion of Jews in Judaism, to see that I can, my small way, make up for it to some extent.
Thank you. So did you, the anger that you had and, the guilt, of your father, parents being in the Holocaust and everything else, did you ever have discussions with Rav Zalman about that? And if you did, what did he say?
My parents didn't speak much about it at all. They never expressed themselves to me about the Holocaust. They told me some basic elements of where they were and what they did, but hardly anything. Did I discuss it with my mentor, Reb Zalman? To my recollection, I don't believe I did. I think Reb Zalman took a very indirect approach to me. He felt, and I think in retrospect, he obviously was right, that the best way that I would be able to come back to the roots was not if it was tackled directly, something as sensitive and something as hurtful as I took it upon myself to feel that guilt, because it wasn't a normal thing. Most of my my friends, etc., didn't have that same degree of concern that seemed to be plaguing me. And I think Reb Zalman took the vantage point that if I can strengthen my alliance with Jewish knowledge in a profound way, then the answers would come eventually. And I guess they did.
And as far as that, he never put any pressure as a Maisa mitzvahs, become more frum, more Hasidic and things like that. Was there any kind of conversation about that?
No, never. Now that you mention it, never. Reb Zalman did two things for me. He introduced me to a worldview which I've taken on with a vengeance ever since, of understanding the nature of the cosmos, the nature of creation, what the Eibishter expects of us, and also what it means to do mitzvahs beyond the obvious external trappings of what a mitzvah is, how we achieve spiritually and change the nature of the world. I remember all those discussions taking place, and of course they've been the same basis of my belief system ever since. So the Reb Zalman's approach was very hands-off, expecting correctly that as I moved closer to things, I would deepen my practice of things at the same time.
I understand. Now, you mentioned, Laibel, your correspondence with the Rebbe. And I also believe, I remember you telling me when I asked you to come, I think twice to California, Los Angeles, to lecture for the people that I was involved with. Anyway, I remember you telling me that I think you had Yechidus, I think a few times, and you were a Hillel director, I believe, out in Milwaukee or somewhere, Wisconsin somewhere, and you had correspondence with the Rebbe. So what I'd like to talk about for a few minutes is the change going from a mentor like Reb Zalman to a Rebbe like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and really how that how you looked at that and how that developed you, and a little bit about that. Sure. I'd like to understand.
Right. So remembering that that my sense of who my mentor was, Reb Zalman, being eons ahead of me, but him speaking of the Rebbe as being eons ahead of him, obviously I was, what's the right word, in awe of who the Rebbe was, and of course curious at the same time. But even before I left Australia, I already had some correspondence, as you mentioned, and I also had a sense that whilst one is in awe of someone like the Rebbe, we were very, very lucky to have a Rebbe who also was very accessible in spite of his absolute status of straddling earth and heaven at the same time, which I'll come to later because it may sound strange and like an exaggeration, but it's not. When I finished law school and was ready to take on my work in law, Reb Zalman suggested to me that I write to the Rebbe seeking a blessing or a bracha for my future. And I did.
Were you married then? Were you married yet?
I was married in my first year. I married in my final year of law school. And my wife comes from a very staunchly frum family, a Litvischer family, if that's understood, that the Hasidic tradition certainly wasn't part of her background at all. But that being the case, and her father was a Talmud Chacham of note in Sydney. I lived in Melbourne. But he was a very open individual who was quite open to the idea of Hasidus at the very same time, quite an unusual person. Anyway, coming back more specifically to your question, so I wrote to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe, out of the blue, made a suggestion to me and put it in a very gentlemanly style. He wrote, would it be possible for me to take a year off from my proposed legal career and to study and to work with academic youth? That was the Rebbe's expression, academic youth. Now, that more or less floored me because I didn't know what that meant in terms of my career path, nor did I understand what the Rebbe meant by academic youth. So Reb Zalman suggested I contact the Secretariat to see if there could be a clarification. And it ended up that the clarification was that Rebbe intended that I should work with Jewish university students. Well, in Australia, there wasn't such a position, a role to play, but in America, there was the Hillel Foundation, which was very strong at the time. And as it turned out, they were looking for international staff so that they could more or less call themselves an international organization. And here was this young Australian who, as a result of the Rebbe's advice, had written to the Hillel Foundation in the United States and very cheekily offered himself as a potential employee in their organization. Well, they lapped it up, apparently, and I was given the choice of 3 places to go and serve as an assistant, more or less a Hillel director in training. And I sent the Rebbe the details and the names of these 3, and the Rebbe underlined the one which was Madison, Wisconsin, of the 3 suggestions. Now, I didn't even know where Wisconsin was on the map of the world, and certainly not Madison. But I was at that stage totally obedient in the sense that I believed strongly in the Rebbe's insight, and I was definitely going to follow the advice. So here was a young married couple who had been married just under a year and had a 2-month-old baby going off to the wilds of Wisconsin, which by then I found on a map, and it was going to be winter, was a very cold place in winter. I had never seen snow. And when we landed in Madison, Wisconsin, it was my first taste of snow, as it turned out. It was very, very interesting because before I left, I inquired more about who the Hillel staff there were. And I discovered that the director there was a conservative rabbi. So I wrote to the Rebbe and asked, how can I called myself a Lubavitcher Chassid already at that time, how could I work with a conservative rabbi? And the Rebbe never responded. And of course, no response from the Rebbe is a response as well. As it turned out, Lo Aleinu, he had a heart problem soon after I arrived that hospitalized him, and eventually, unfortunately, he was nifter, he passed away. So he was a young guy at the age of 22, myself, in charge of a beautiful, big Hillel building, 3-story building, right on the heart of one of the wildest campuses of that day. We're talking about the early 70s, right? 1771 it was. And I had to use my own initiative. Well, I actually relished such situations. I always did. I wasn't at all overawed, and I took it up with a vengeance, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. And I had staff, and I had building, and what could you ask more? Of course, my question was, what was my mission statement? Not from Hillel's point of view, because Hillel's mission statement was clear that their role is to keep Jewish students together, a very laudable one. But my mission statement is a Lubavitcher Chassid in that context. And I'll soon share with you my first Yechidus with the Rabbi, which centered around this very question. Soon after arriving there, I discovered that there was a minyan, a Shabbos minyan, at the Hillel Center but there was no mechitza. It was a mixed minyan. So I already had a dilemma as to how I should behave and act in that context. And that was an immediate dilemma, even before I got a chance to visit the Rebbe and ask in person. And the Rebbe answered very quickly, and he said a very interesting response. And I want to preface it by saying that whatever that advice was, which I will share with you now, doesn't necessarily extend to other places and other circumstances. It was to me specifically in my context there. The Rebbe said I should attend the minyan, but make sure that they see I'm not davening there, and always give a shiur in some shape or form. That were the Rebbe's words. At any rate, suffice it to say that within a year, Baruch Hashem, we had a proper minyan with a full mechitza, and everything changed very, very much for the better. But in between that, I had the occasion to visit the Rebbe with my wife, and it was a very, very wonderful Yechidus with the Rebbe. We were scheduled, shall I go on? Is it okay?
Yeah, go on, please.
We were scheduled to have our appointment with the Rebbe. It was set for 3 o'clock in the morning. As you know, as we all know, the Rebbe worked in those days through the night very often, a few days a week, because of all the number of guests who wanted advice from the Rebbe. And I remember being in line, we had our baby in our arms, and the baby was not settled, and it was all a little bit, the whole experience was unsettling, waiting in line, etc. And there was this gentleman in front of me, a chassid, bright red hair, and I tried to speak to him a few times, but clearly he was not very communicative. And finally, after a whole row of people, line of people had finished, it was just up to him, and we were behind him. So we figured finally we'll go in, and it was approaching 3 o'clock actually. And that gentleman went in, and he stayed for over an hour and a quarter. Everyone else had 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, and he was in there for an hour. I later learned that his surname was Steinsaltz. He was the famous Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, and was receiving advice on the Gemaras that he was going to re-edit in a format that made it much easier and popular for people to study Talmud. And obviously the Rebbe was giving him advice on that, I imagine many other things. Anyway, finally our turn came, and I was determined to try to remember every single thing that was going to take place in the Yechidus. And the truth of the matter is, it was pretty much of a blur, but I do remember a lot of the content of the Rebbe speaking. And I had a series of questions. I had actually taken pen to paper, and before going in a day earlier, had written a series, I can't remember, a dozen questions or so. I've got them here, it's still on file. And when I walked into the room with my wife, I could see that my letter was there at the top of the pile, as was my turn, and a number of my previous letters seemed to be located beneath it. The Rebbe was completely up to date. The Rebbe picked up my latest letter, and almost as if he was reading it for the first time, he was going through it and made little marks. And that took, I think, a full 2 minutes, which seemed like an eternity. And then the Rebbe turned to me and said, firstly, do you want me to speak in Yiddish or English? My wife's Yiddish wasn't so great, and she said she prefers English. And secondly, the Rebbe said, do you wish me to answer these questions now or respond to you in writing? And I was nonplussed. I didn't know what to say. So the Rebbe just began answering the questions. Of course, I kicked myself because I could have had all these in written answer, very specific for posterity, and I had to rely on my own memory instead. A couple of the questions I'll share. One of the things that I found myself, 2 questions. One, there were there was a community of Jewish people in Madison, a non-campus, a non-university community, small one. I think it was about 300 people. But my campus had Jewish students, of which there were 7,000. 7,000 Jewish students on this campus out of a then population of 49,000, I was told, was the campus in Madison. And it was a very, very, as I said, popular campus because it was a counterculture and it was known to be a seat of radicalism and the like. And therefore, a lot of New Yorkers, of the 7,000, majority were New Yorkers who came there. But I felt that there was some responsibility I might have for the small Jewish community. Now, it should be understood that in those days, Chabad houses, the few of them that did exist then, were all campus oriented. There wasn't such a thing as a community Chabad house. The early Chabad houses of the early 70s were all campus centers, interestingly. A lot of people don't realize that today. Anyway, because I viewed myself as a Lubavitcher Chassid first, so I asked the Rebbe, what's my responsibility to the community and to the students? And the Rebbe said very, very straightforwardly that his words were very strong. He said, the older generation have had their chance. Now it's the turn of the younger people. Very strong, giving great clarity where I should direct myself to. And then the Rebbe continued without me asking anything further on this point and said like this: if you see two people, God forbid, drowning, and one of them is your family and the other one is a stranger, and you only have the opportunity to save one of them, and you choose to save your family member, no one will criticize you that you've acted in some way immorally. And then the Rebbe said to me, your brothers and sisters are drowning. Your responsibility is to save them. So it was very, very clear. That was one particular question. Another significant question I had was a lot of students were approaching me for conversion, non-Jewish students. Remember, we're talking a period where young people were adventurous and they were prepared to explore, and the idea of Jewish mysticism was already at its height there, and Kabbalah was there together with Buddhism and everything else in one big cholent pot. And a lot of students were confused. And some of them came to me and said they want to be Jewish. They happen to somehow find themselves enjoying some readings in some second and third hand Jewish books on Jewish mysticism. So I asked the Rebbe how I should deal with these students. The first thing that the Rebbe said was, you should first ask them to meet with your colleague chaplains. Being a Hill director, I was also the Jewish chaplain on campus, and there were non-Jewish chaplains, Catholic, Protestants, and others, etc., and ensure that the student has a better understanding of the tradition in which he or she may have been raised. This was really eye-opening, number one. No, I hadn't thought of that one. And then the Rebbe said, and then there'll be some of them who will continue asking you and believe they want to learn to be Jewish. And you will then have to point out to them, this is close to what the Rebbe said, all the difficulties and obstacles that you face in life as a Jew in terms of mitzvahs, how you have to keep kosher, how you have to keep Shabbos, and how restrictive all that is, and to point that out, obviously. And then the Rebbe said, and notwithstanding that, there'll be some who nevertheless say, Rabbi, I still want to pursue it. The Rebbe said, you will then direct them to a rabbi, a competent rabbi, who will sit and teach them. And if they should then reach a point where they face an beis din, and the Rebbe then emphasized, and obviously it should be a proper Orthodox beis din, then they will continue their journey. And then the Rebbe said, they will succeed. Now the Rebbe said something very interesting. He said that look at the grammatical root involved when you say a poor man becomes wealthy. And in Hebrew, it's ani, that's the poor man with an ayin, ani, shema'ushar, who becomes wealthy. Two very different words. Then the Rebbe said, look at the word of a slave who becomes free, which is an eved shemeshuchar. So you have two very different words, but it's in this arena we're speaking about ger shemiskayer. Look, the Rebbe said, how the root is the same. It means that there's no such thing as conversion. Nothing changes. There's no such thing as conversion in Judaism. What you have is that a person who goes through a proper process of a beis din and succeeds means that their neshama was always Jewish. But for reasons best known to the Eibishter, that Yiddish neshama was born deliberately into a non-Jewish environment through a non-Jewish mother, because that was the test of this neshama in this lifetime, to find itself. And therefore, this were the concluding words on this point by the Rebbe. Therefore, you have, the Shulchan Aruch says, you have to respect a ger and a geyeres more so than someone who's naturally born Jewish, because that is a Jewish soul who's gone through a much more severe test and passed it.
Interesting.
There were just two aspects of that Yechidus, and I was fortunate enough to have 8 more Yechidus.
Eight
None
more?
of them as 8 more. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
None of them as long as this. This one was 48 minutes altogether. The second one was 17 minutes, and then they became very normal, 2-3 minutes, etc., etc. I was fortunate to be able, as the years went on, to come with more and more members of my own family, immediate family, and then at one stage, my parents decided that they too would like to go to Yechidus, to the Rebbe. After all, my father had gravitated towards Chabad early in his immigration to Australia after some 8 to 10 years, because he came from a Hasidic background. Chabad was the Hasidic song in town, and therefore he davened at the Lubavitch Yeshiva and was always there part of the Yeshiva and became very close to the Rabbi Groner. Right. And learned Hasidus there as well.
Right. Let me ask you, Laibel, what year did you leave Madison?
So we stayed in Madison 3.5 years. And in 1973, my wife was very, very lonely in Madison, while I thrived and enjoyed the Wildkeit of the life there on campus. My wife very much missed community, and we were the only from people in town. And this was very difficult for her. And we wrote to the Rebbe about this point, and the Rebbe said that perhaps we should see if we could find another position. And I spoke with Hillel, and they allowed me to take up a position that was available in the New York area on Long Island, and it was at Hofstra University on Long Island. And I spent another 4 years there at Hofstra University. And then I was invited back to start Hillel in Australia after the first attempt wasn't so successful. And I took it over and spent another 9 years then here working on Melbourne campuses. At that point, B'nai B'rith, who were the sponsors of Hillel, had gone through economic deprivation, and they offloaded Hillel in Australia. It no longer existed. And therefore, in a sense, I was out of a job. And I spoke with Rabbi Groner, and we started a Chabad campus program on the campuses in Melbourne, which I worked a good number of years at launching at that time.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, when your parents went to Yechidus, did the Rebbe talk to your father, your mother about their Holocaust experience or anything like that, or not? No.
If they did, I'm not aware of it. I know that my mother was always very upset that her son didn't become a lawyer. And if certainly she had given up hope that I'd be a doctor because I had studied law. So she personified her antipathy in the Rebbe. So she wasn't well disposed to the Rebbe. My father, of course, who was raised in a more Hasidic environment as a child and as a youth, etc., had profound respect for the Rebbe. So when they went into Yechidus, the rationale primarily was that my mother was going to give the Rebbe a piece of her mind. That was the kind of attitude. And she was told before going in that you stand, you don't shake hands, and etc., etc. And when they entered, the Rebbe asked my mother to sit down. And she continued standing, and the Rebbe says, please sit down a second time. So she sat down because the Rebbe said it a second time, etc. And the Rebbe treated my mother with kid gloves. And when she said in a nice way, wouldn't it have been much better for my son to have been a frum Hasidic lawyer, and what an example he would have been to others, etc. The Rebbe said to my mother, are you trying to bribe me? At any rate, the Rebbe's charm worked wonders. Whatever happened in that Yechidus, my mother came out being, from that moment on, one of the Rebbe's strongest supporters, and she went to Reb Zalman Serebriansky, and who was then still, Baruch Hashem, running Yeshiva Gedola, and she offered her services that she would take over and make sure that the students were well looked after, had proper food, had proper bed clothing, etc. And for many years, she took on that role.
Wow. Did you ever go back to Radomsk or wherever? Did you ever go back to Poland? And what were your feelings?
I did go back to Poland, but no, it wasn't to rediscover anything about my roots whatsoever. My parents bred within me a complete hate of Poland, as they did. And I had no intentions whatsoever. But as part of my later career, which I had been in for the last 40 years of traveling and lecturing, I was invited to come to Warsaw and lecture to the Jewish community there. Rabbi Stambler there invited me. So I went and lectured. I flew in that day, I lectured that night, and I left the next day. I didn't want to spend even the minimum amount of time in Poland. There was a second time, and the second time I stayed 2 days because I wanted to go to the base Olam there, which is an eerie, huge cemetery in a forest. The biggest cemetery, I think, in Europe. It's like 25 kilometers one way and 15 kilometers the other way, but all forest. And
I was there.
So you know, dark, and you've got these tombstones that are fallen on the ground or at an inclined angle. Anyway, I wanted to go there because some of the Radomsk famous Hasidim were buried there, and I wanted very much to go to the Kvarim on behalf of my father. So we spent that extra day in Krakow for that reason. But I never had, and still have, no cheshek whatsoever to have anything to do with Poland.
So the cemetery we went to was in Krakow, not in Warsaw?
I'm sorry, I said Krakow because that was I was born. It was in Warsaw.
In Warsaw.
Yes, quite correct.
Laibel, I want to conclude with the following, the question.
Yes.
40 years of working with youth, working now also with people, including non-Jewish people, mysticism, Kabbalah, New Age, and I think in Lubavitch for sure, in Chabad, and I believe even, you know, as far as the world, you're one of the leaders or maybe the leader for as a Yid and as a Lubavitcher for sure in this field. I know many,
Yes,
many people, and everyone kulam ahuvim, kulam kadoshim, and everyone's good and has their
sure,
cup. But
sure, sure.
we've really, really, done wonders in this field. We today, I believe you know this, but I see it here, I see it in Eretz Yisrael. We today are having a counterculture revolution from within.
Mm.
And I don't mean only in Chabad, I mean in Orthodoxy, okay? Of all kinds, from the Young Israel to Chabad, to the Sephardic, to the Litva, all groups, okay? My question is,
yes,
do you believe and have you seen that what you're offering to the outside people would benefit the inside people and really change their attitude, and they would become happier and simply enjoy being a Yid, an Orthodox Jew, a Frum Jew, etc., together with an ability to be open-minded? You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I know exactly what you're saying.
Okay, so this is what I wanted you for a few minutes to address, please.
It's true that the vast majority of my encounters with people have been with people who have not been raised or are familiar with Yiddishkeit per se. Even my travels to Buddhist ashrams, why did I do that? Because half of the people there are Jewish. Right. And therefore they're sensitive spiritual people, so you have a good chance to make a connection with them through Yiddishkeit. Yes. But your question is on what's happening from the inside. And I think that one of the things we're discovering that there is a greater degree of disassociation by the children of religious people to their Yiddishkeit than what was the case once upon a time. And I see two reasons for it, and then I'll tell you the solution, which is very much along the lines that you've said or implied. And that is this: when people do religious things by rote, when Jewish people do things because they belong to a club, when they do things because of pure loyalty and nothing else, when there isn't any teichen, real content, depth, when there isn't any pathway of understanding that this relates to your inner life, when there isn't a profound belief in the Eibishter operating in every element of your life, then it's very, very hard to pass anything on to the next generation. They'll see the externalities that you're going through the motions, and they'll see the hypocrisy involved there. Now, I don't blame people, because people, even religious people, I've met so many religious people who I doubt believe in the Eibishter. I know it's a strange thing to say. I sat on one occasion next to an individual who was garbed in a fur spotic. How do you translate that in English? And the garb of a shtreimel, and it was a Shabbos, and he's surtik and everything, and I asked him a question, something to do with Yiddishkeit, and he says to me, now this is a guy I'm thinking, you don't really believe in an Eibishter, do you? So I asked him, but what about you? He says, I'm only doing it because of my family, meaning I belong to such a family, I play ball. It's so upsetting. Now, how do you expect a younger generation to respond to that when the parents aren't believing? When you believe, you see it in your eyes, you see it in the face, you see it in the energy that you pour in, and through osmosis, it transfers to the younger generation. But when it's lacking, they see through you. And that's why I see a lot of disassociation with Judaism, even within religious ranks. and which is very, very sad. So the answer to your question is, I have absolutely no doubt that what Hasidus offers is that pathway back in to a strong connection to Hashem, to give an underpinning for the meaning of everything that you do. I'm writing, you write books. I'm writing a book at the moment. And that book at the moment is 24 hours in the life of a Jew. And it speaks about, what does it mean to wake up in the morning? What does it mean to dress in the morning? What does it mean to go to the bathroom in the morning? Spiritually, all these things. What does it mean to go to the toilet in the morning? And somehow that's got absolute meaning in the total spiritual sense of something divine. I know it's crazy to say, but when you live a life where everything is meaningful, you become fulfilled. And I think that's lacking at all levels, both outside and even on the inside, as you described. And Hasidus can fill it.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful talking and really making this program, Meaningful Interviews, meaningful. And I felt very heartfelt, and as we say in Hebrew, El HaNekuda, right to the point. Hashem should bless you and your family with only Yiddish, Chassidish, and Nachas, and health, and really tremendous more hatzlacha in the work that you took upon yourself with the Rebbe's guidance so many years ago. And the results are obvious, and there's so much more to do because we still need Mashiach to come, and we should
absolutely
have the Geula Shlema.
Amen.
Have a good
Thank
talk,
you.
a good
Very
Nacht,
well.
wherever you are. Only good things.
And a Freilichen Purim.
Freilichen Purim. Sei gesund. Bye-bye.
Sei gesund. Thank you. Bye. Good to speak to you.